Thanks everyone for joining us, the Project Censored radio show. I am your co-host, Eleanor Goldfield, and we're very glad right now to be joined again by Dr. Austin Kocher, who's a political and legal geographer studying the theory of laws and institutional practices behind immigration enforcement. His research focuses on the political and legal geography of immigration enforcement, examining topics such as mass immigrant surveillance, the digitization of asylum processes, and the impacts of immigration policies on vulnerable populations. He's assistant research professor in the Office of Research and Creative Activity in the S.I. Newhouse of Public Communication at Syracuse University, affiliated faculty member with the Department of Geography at the Maxwell School, and an affiliated expert at the Institute for Democracy, Journalism, and Citizenship. He is also a research fellow at American University's Center for Latin American and Latino Studies and the Immigration Lab, and somehow still has time to sit down with us. So, Austin, thanks so much for joining us again.
Always glad to have this conversation. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. And I want to start off here because back in May, we're recording this June 9th, so people are aware, Politico released an analysis that reveals judges have ruled against ICE detention practices in roughly 90% of cases since the agency mandated that millions of immigrants must be locked up while they face deportation proceedings. And at the time, I texted you and basically asked, should we be excited about this? Like, should I temper any kind of excitement? And you said that it is indeed a huge deal, but of course, nothing fixes everything. So I've waited patiently to get more insight into this. So tell us, why is this a big deal? I mean, especially because things are illegal all day long with ICE, but they don't seem to care. And what effect does this have on thousands of people that are in concentration camps or have already been deported?
Yeah, so here's the backstory to what's going on. So this administration decided to creatively interpret immigration law, as it has done many times in illegal ways, to claim the right to be able to hold people indefinitely who are facing the deportation process, going through removal proceedings or facing upcoming deportation. And this is really unique because this is not something that's ever been done before at this scale. It's part of their attempt to implement this mass detention system that's required to implement mass deportation, but it obviously runs afoul of the law. So the fact that the federal judges who, and I just want to say, I don't find, our court system often does make good decisions, and it is often a venue of last resort when the government is doing something that is just facially illegal. It's not some huge bulwark that protects democracy. We've seen decisions come out of the Supreme Court and other federal judges make decisions that support, bizarre policies and practices by this administration. But it really is significant because it makes it so clear that so many judges, including Trump-appointed judges, just find this practice of indefinite detention of everyone illegal. Will it change what the administration is doing? Sometimes. And for the individuals who are subject of those cases, they're fortunately being released. And maybe one of the best things about the lawsuits isn't just that they're getting released, but it's that the lawsuits provide so much additional information and detail about what's happening inside of detention. So it's actually a really important trove of information about the dangerous and dehumanizing practices of detention these days. Cumulatively, I think that it has the potential to push the Supreme Court to potentially, again, strike down this kind of practice. But, we'll see.
Yeah, and as you and others have noted in the past, the law does not move quickly. So, for those languishing in concentration camps, it's not like this is the liberation of Dachau or anything. And in that same vein, there's apparently a new tactic to speed up deportation hearings. And I don't know if they've started implementing this because of because of things like we just discussed, but it's called mega masters. And these are court hearings that include 100 or more people at a time. That's up from 2 or 3 dozen people at a time, which had been typical before for a first hearing. For many immigrants, this is their first appearance in court to try to make their case to be able to stay in the U.S. And according to reports, these hearings largely target those without lawyers, i.e. those among us who understand legalese like about as well as we do quantum physics, are more likely to be missing paperwork, misunderstanding notices, showing up late, or not realizing that the hearing date changed, and that this can then prompt a deportation order. So could you walk us through supposedly what these hearings are and really like kind of the layers of atrocity here, because even if you have everything in order, it's not uncommon for people to be kidnapped as they show up for a hearing that they're supposed to be at.
Absolutely. This is one more step in a series of steps to try to completely delegitimize the legal process and to strip immigrants of whatever is left of due process, which has never been very robust in immigration proceedings to begin with. I've spent so much of my career sitting in immigration court hearings in the back of those courtrooms, taking notes, watching the proceedings, understanding what's going on from the Obama administration to Trump to Biden to Trump again. Probably the most important thing for folks to understand is that the master calendar hearing is basically the first appearance in court. That's what a master calendar hearing is. So it's the first time that person has come to court. As you said, people are less likely or less inclined to come to court and try to go through the legal process, knowing that they could be snatched up and disappeared. So people have legitimate fears about showing up for court. And what they're doing now is, as you said, it used to be, a couple dozen master calendar hearings in the morning. Basically, you go in 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning. The lobby would be, filled with people who have their master calendar hearing. The court's open. Everybody goes in and sits in the pews. Basically, they look like church pews in the back of the courtroom until they're called up. And under normal conditions, people would be called up. The judge would explain what's happening. They'd explain the process. They would sometimes even figure out, is the person seeking humanitarian protection of some kind, because there's so many people who are fleeing violence, who are coming to the country to pursue what they are legally entitled to pursue, which is asylum. And again, typically what would happen is, to make sure that the court runs efficiently, that individual would be scheduled for a future hearing so that they have time to get an attorney, get their paperwork together. All of this is just normal, basic, boring due process stuff. What this administration is now doing with these mega masters is shoving not just a couple dozen, but 100 or more hearings into a single morning. So no longer do judges have time to explain what's going on with these cases. No longer are people going to have as much of an option to get an attorney and get the paperwork that they need to file any claims and to contest their deportation in court. And frankly, it just turns the entire immigration court system into even more of an assembly line for deportation. And, it makes sense within what this administration has claimed, because it wasn't that long ago that they started referring to immigration judges as deportation judges, which is not what they're called, but it is effectively what they're trying to turn them into.
Well, and that, I mean, thank you for the transition here. I mean, at the same time, the administration is firing immigration judges, and unlike pretty much any other industry in the US, going on a hiring spree of what they term deportation judges. Is that then linked to this, the mega masters?
Absolutely. I mean, immigration judges don't have as much discretion and latitude as a traditional sort of real, quote unquote, real federal judge that has more independence. Immigration judges can't decide or ask questions about constitutionality of certain laws. It's very procedural. But at the same time, having control over that procedure really means having control over the future of that person. And so getting rid of judges who want to do things the right way, even within the old broken system, the right way, and offer some semblance of due process, they're firing those judges and bringing in judges who are more likely to say, you show up to a master calendar hearing, how many of those 100 cases, instead of giving them a continuance of, 4 or 8 weeks to find an attorney, how many of those judges are now going to say, hey, it's day one. Do you have paperwork? Do you have a case? You could have gotten an attorney before today. And if you show up and you don't have anything, I'm gonna try to get your case done today. So I'm worried, and we'll see what the data says as we get more evidence about this. But I'm really worried that they're hiring judges who are just going to say deported, 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 and not give anyone the chance to ever even contest their deportation.
And like in other areas, are these quote unquote deportation judges, are these also people that have no frame of reference? Like these are not experienced immigration judges. Is that also something we're saying?
Very often, I mean, the people who make it onto the immigration judge bench, it's a topic of endless fascination to me. The pool of candidates that the government tends to draw from are former ICE prosecute. Technically, they're not but prosecutors. So they're hiring prosecutors to put on the bench. We see this in criminal law as well, but it happens a lot in immigration law. And that can certainly create a sort of perception and reality of bias because, someone who spent the last 15 years prosecuting immigrants and now they're a judge, they're supposed to decide independently. Sometimes immigration attorneys who defend immigrant clients also make it onto the bench. That's always good to have that mix. There's been also a tend in this administration to fire judges and replace them by military judges uh, or by political appointees who are just ideologically aligned. However, one of the most interesting things is I know people have had legitimate concerns about putting military judges on the bench, but actually, when they started doing, I thought, oh, this is going to be interesting because military judges, as much as that might sound like, oh, they're just going to side with the administration, at least military judges do come from a background of some structure and ordinance or order and like some adherence and commitment to procedure and institution, which is not what this administration wants. So interestingly, there's been military judges who have come in and gone, this is a shit show. They're trying to figure out how to be an immigration judge and trying to make decisions that fit the independence and judicial expertise that they were hired into. And then they've gotten fired for doing that. So military judges are also not some sort of magic solution here. But yeah, this is what they're doing. They are trying to they're trying to basically pad the court. I mean, we talk about what's the term? Stacking the court, the Supreme Court, packing the court. The Trump administration is already packing the courts, and they're doing it in the immigration court too.
Yeah, I mean, why not? um, and I sort of shifting away from the courtroom here to another totally useless entity, Congress. The Senate. As you listen to this, the House may have also voted, but as of today, June 9th, the Senate passed a funding package ensuring that ICE and Co. get $70 billion. So, Austin, could you walk us through like what's in this $70 billion and what about all that posturing the Dems were doing about demanding things in return for funding ICE?
Yes. Boy, what's going on in Congress right now is a real mess. So the Senate passed a $70 billion funding bill for immigration enforcement, something the president specifically asked for. They're trying to get around the appropriations process, which is a place where Democrats have sort of seen an opportunity to push for accountability and transparency in exchange for more funding, which is a difficult thing for me to wrap my head around. But I will say, talking to people on the Hill, I do understand that there is some strategy there that, one of the things that the way that our government works, whether we like it or not, and I mostly don't, but one of the ways it works is the opportunity for accountability and demanding transparency does often come tied in with funding. So in a way, one of the challenges we're seeing right now, for instance, we don't know how many people are sitting in immigrant detention centers right now because the quote unquote lack of funding or the lack of appropriations bill for DHS means that there's all kinds of things that are normally tied into that appropriations that we don't get. So they're not producing data, they're not publishing data, they're not publishing information about how many people are in detention and which detention facilities are even being used right now. And we won't see that data again until the appropriations process sort of comes through the other side and there's funding plus, so it's a very dangerous and it's a very convoluted way of doing it. But basically the $70 billion is just going to pile on top of the $150 billion or more that we saw last time, that expands immigration policing and enforcement, expands immigrant detention, expands deportation flights, all of this. A very dangerous system. We just saw another immigrant detention death a couple days ago. So this is, in my view, not a system that deserves funding for sure. And it does something also that I think is really important for anybody who cares about this to understand, is that it's not just 1 year. This is what the administration is trying to do, what Republicans are trying to do, is to get as much funding into ICE for as long as possible, knowing that they may lose the House and may lose the Senate in the midterms, that they may lose the White House in the next administration. They're trying to have as much spending money as possible. And so this funding is not just for this year, it's actually for several years.
Which I also think is funny because every Democratic president has boosted funding for ICE, so
Yes.
it's not like they'd be like, "Oh, the horror, horror." Um,
Yeah,
and I
Democrats don't really balk at funding immigration enforcement. So that's not typically a problem.
yeah, yeah. Um, but anyway, not going off on that tangent, but I also wanted to get your take on this because this was like it almost seemed like another little sliver of potential good news. This was in your Substack newsletter last week about immigration numbers that we got our first concentration camp subjected to a health inspection. As you note, a federal judge ordered the Otay Mesa Detention Center, a 1,400 facility run by Core Civic near San Diego, to admit San Diego County health inspectors and to complete the inspection no later than June 17th. And you note that the county is the first in California to test an inspection authority that a 2024 state law created. So, I mean, I can't imagine that they'll pass a health inspection. Know what I know about these places. But I'm also curious, what are the ramifications if they don't pass? Because obviously, a law, you mentioned this 2024 state law, it's a law is only as good as its enforcement. So, what happens if they don't pass? And what kind of precedent does this set, not just in California, but outside of California?
Yeah, this is really the crux of, I would say, a combination of anti-deportation activism and just good local and state governance, policy evolution. So, with the massive explosion of detention facilities under this administration, there's been hundreds of different locations used to hold immigrants across the country, and the question that a lot of people at the state and local level I mean, state and local government, this, it's like, it's not sexy. It's mostly like potholes and like, do children have food, and is the hospital more or less running, and are people not being put in demonstrably unsafe conditions. And so immigrant detention, which has expanded rapidly during this administration, there's been several hundred different locations where immigrants have been held, and an increase in the number of long-term facilities in places like the highly contested Delaney Hall in New Jersey right now, where a big part of the complaint and the concern isn't just like local officials saying like, oh, we should abolish ICE. It's local and state officials going, if you're going to hold 1,000 people inside of a warehouse, we need to make sure that that facility is appropriate for even holding people. And what ICE and its contractors are saying is, you don't get to come in. You don't get to look at this. This is a federal matter. We're not going to let you inspect. And when governors and mayors and then health inspectors try to come in, they refuse to allow them access. And when people do get access, to your point, we often find all kinds of issues that people shouldn't be held there anyway, just on a ethical and political basis, but even just from a health perspective. So a lot of what's happening right now, and this is why this is so important in Otay Mesa, is this is the first case where a judge has said, no, you don't get to just avoid basic public health law just because you're holding immigrants. We're not going to carve out some unique, place, or at least, again, in this case, the judge is saying we're not going to. So I think it's really important. And I think it's probably one of the most productive areas for people who are interested in like, oh, what do I do? Figure out where the nearest detention center is near you, and try to let your local elected officials know, hey, you don't even have to say, I think we should stop all the deportation planes and like stop arresting. It's not even that political. It's actually just saying like, what are the health standards that apply here, and why are there 1,000 people being held in a warehouse that was supposed to just hold Amazon junk, right? And so I think that's one thing that's important for people to understand. And the second question is, will it matter? I think it could. I think it's just very untested at this point. So figuring out what would be the consequence if they failed to pass a health inspection, which they're likely to do. And many of these facilities, by the way, have already failed to pass health inspections in the past, but those inspections have been done by federal contractors who, frankly, there is no accountability mechanism. I actually have some colleagues who wrote a book called Immigrant Detention Inc., and they talk about the certification industry. There's this whole like para industry around certifying detention centers, which is largely just baloney.
Well, and I'm curious because previously we had on the show Logan Davis to talk about these ice hold rooms. He's with the Colorado Times Recorder, and it did great investigative journalism into that. And his point was that there is like some chafing between the federal and state and local jurisdictions. So how does that shake out? I mean, like, how far can the federal government go into saying, "Yeah, you just like, this is not your thing," when we're obviously on state property or like, how does that even shake out?
Sure. I think there's a lot of questions here that are unanswered because we've never had an administration who's done what this administration is doing. So this is really untested. So I think we are going to learn a lot about what's possible in this area. But I think one thing that I just think is like we can't ignore is the Republicans have said for years, oh, state rights, state rights, state rights. We don't want big government. We don't want the federal government telling us what to do. Like everything should be local decisions, all that. Well, here we have a situation where it is state and local saying, hey, you're in our backyard. It's our job and our responsibility and our right to like police what's going on there. And all of a sudden, the US government is saying, no, no, big government, big government, big government. You don't get to tell us what to do. You don't get to go in the facility. There are some legal exceptions and details here around when a local company or contract is directly with the federal government. There are some exceptions that are made to sort of how some of the regulations and oversight happens in those cases. But again, it's untested, and so I certainly don't want to pretend to be able to predict exactly where this will go. But again, I do think that this is the most important thing to watch. It's not as it doesn't feel like it's always as headline making, but I do think that if we see a significant pushback and retraction of the detention system, it will be on these grounds.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot basically everything we discuss on the show is deemed not headline worthy, including the what's been happening outside of Delaney, but also I think as organizers pointed out, the focus should really be what's going on inside these concentration camps because what's going on outside would not have happened without, and that's not to say that, these people being beaten and tear gassed and all of that is not newsworthy and isn't important. But rather that it's important that we also continue to frame the issues on the inside. And I was curious if you heard, I don't know, I haven't been able to corroborate this, but a few accounts had posted that Geo Group, who owns the Delaney Center, is trying to sue the people who went on hunger and work strikes inside of Delaney, and I'm curious if you have any information about that, and also just kind of like your general feelings about these kind of popcorning hunger and work strikes across concentration camps.
I think it's a really important tactic and strategy that's been used many times inside detention centers, inside concentration camps, inside of jails and prisons in this country. It's so important, when people are held and reduced to their most basic aspects of existence, which is simply their most basic biological functions. Those biological functions become the only resource that that they have as people to fight back. And so a hunger strike is literally like, this is the end of the line. All I have left is to prove to the world how bad things are by refusing to eat. Literally, I will waste away inside. It's that bad until something happens. It's such a powerful tactic. It's heartbreaking. It's tragic, but for someone who is at that point where that becomes necessary, it sends a really strong message. And I think what we're seeing is the accumulation of all of the damage and all of the neglect and all of the violence that's being done to people inside as we've seen over the last year, it's accumulating into people saying, it's not just one of us, it's not just a couple of us, it's all of us. We have to work together to do this. So I think it's crucial. And I did not see that Geo Group was suing its own detainees. I mean, that's absurd to me. It makes sense in the context of how that industry works. But I mean, they're already exploited labor. These facilities, they save money for cleaning services by essentially, they call it a voluntary work program, but it's very much a compelled work program where people who are held inside are being forced to clean. So I can't imagine what that lawsuit looks like. But I mean, talk about just the corruption and the absolute depravity of that industry is just laid bare in something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, as we've talked about on the show, like you just have to look at the history of the US to understand where this comes from. I mean, slavery is still legal, and just recently Louisiana judge said that, hey, slavery is okay, but you need to give more shade, basically with regards to forced labor in Angola, the quote unquote farm line, where people who have been in Angola have said that people would literally rather risk going into solitary for not wanting to be on the farm line than actually go out, because it is that awful. And it's slavery. And the judge basically said, "Oh, well, there's some heat violations here, but you can keep doing it." So, I mean, it's like perpetuate, and then and that's where these concentration camps come from. It comes from this long legacy and history of forced labor and the total dehumanization of people deemed lesser than by the system. So,
It does.
good times. Austin, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us and again, once again, like tease out a lot of this tangled web of inhumanity. Folks can check out Austin's Substack at austinkocher.substack.com, and I'm sure I will be bugging you again to come detangle things with us again soon.
Anytime. You're doing such important work, and I'm proud to be a part of it. Thank you.